So one of the issues we've really tried to consistently cover on this show, because it is so central to literally everyone, is the issue of housing. And with that in mind, we are really happy to be joined by an author, Brian Goldstone, and journalist who's just put on a fantastic new book called There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America, that takes a look at a number of families in and around the Atlanta area who are working, doing everything right, and yet still, because of the cost of housing, find themselves homeless, a much undercovered, and I guess we could talk to Brian about whether or not it's a new dynamic. But Brian, great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Krystal. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, of course. Just tell us, share if you would, the inspiration for the book, and also a little bit about just one of these families and how they end up in this situation.
Yeah, so I first got launched into the subject when my wife, who's a nurse practitioner, was working at a community health center here in Atlanta where we live. And she was just stunned by this trend that she was seeing where, patients who were working at like Walmart or McDonald's or driving for Uber and Lyft, when they finished their shifts, they weren't going to an apartment, they were going to shelters or living with others or sleeping in the very cars they had just done, an airport run in for Uber and Lyft. And so as she told me about that, I was shocked. I was like, I haven't, in all of the reading I've done about homelessness, I've never seen this sort of discussed, this phenomenon of the working homeless. And so I ended up writing a magazine story for the New Republic about it. And even when that was over, I felt like I had only scratched the surface. And one of the families who I profile in the book, who I followed, I think their story really illustrates this trend, this dynamic where families aren't falling into homelessness; they're really being pushed. This one family, Celeste is the parent's name. Her story begins in this really dramatic way with her rental home burning down, but as the reporting shows, it wasn't this dramatic house fire that pushed her family into homelessness. It was the fact that months later, after the house burned down, she realized that the private equity firm that owned her home, who was her landlord, had filed an eviction on her on a home that was no longer standing, that was literally uninhabitable. And her credit score was tanked, this 3-digit number that has come to determine whether millions of Americans have access to something as basic as a place to live. Her credit was destroyed, and that is what forced her and her children into homelessness.
And what are some of the common, I'm sure every story is, unique, but what are some of the commonalities throughout the families and the people that you talked to? What are some of the common themes?
Yeah, each of the 5 families who I followed over several years, to write this book, they all have really singular, really distinctive stories and journeys. But I think what comes through really clearly is the common denominator that the reason so many people are becoming homeless in this country is because they don't have access to housing they can afford. And, the term working homeless really demands that we confront not just the homeless side of that equation, but the working side as well. These are people who are working and working and working some more. And it's not just that their wages are too low, although there's certainly that as well. It's that the very nature of work has changed for millions of Americans. It's become ever more volatile, insecure. People don't know how many hours they're going to be working from one week to the next. Celeste, that woman who I just talked about, whose house burned down, she was later diagnosed with ovarian and breast cancer, and she was having to choose, do I go to my warehouse job or do I go to my chemo treatment? Because if I miss a shift at work, I don't get paid. And then me and my kids go from being in this squalid extended stay hotel room to being on the street. So that it's not just wages, it's not just rents. It's that the nature of work and really the nature of housing, a lack of basic tenant rights and tenant protections that has caused homelessness to rise to the highest level in recorded history.
Yeah, it's really a perfect storm that spells disaster for these families, because you have years of wage stagnation, years of attacks on unions, it fits in with the conversations we've been having about deindustrialization and, the fact that it is so difficult to earn a living wage in this country. And then you add to that skyrocketing rents, skyrocketing housing costs, and you have utter disaster for so many families that are trying to do everything right, they're working hard, they're trying to, follow the playbook of how you get ahead in America, and it just doesn't work for so many people now. I was curious as I was reading the book. I'm sure you've been watching some of the discourse about the abundance agenda, and how one of the factors that has led to housing unaffordability is too many onerous zoning regulations and the way that's limited construction or made it so that it's there's less affordable housing available. I just was curious, based on your reporting with these individuals and the dynamics that go into the housing market, how much of a fix some of that you think really would be?
Yeah, I mean, I take a kind of ecumenical approach to solutions and how we can finally solve this mounting catastrophe. I think we need a kind of both and approach. But I do think that simply like deregulating the market, letting the market do its thing, cutting the red tape, and really allowing the private market to sort of provide for the housing needs of Americans who need it is not adequate. I think what some of that discourse maybe leaves out is power, the question of power, who has it, who doesn't have it, the immense power asymmetry that exists in this country between the renter class and those who are fortunate enough to own property and to be landlords. And also, I think what's missing is just how incredibly profitable all this insecurity has become, not just for, NIMBY homeowners who don't want an affordable housing complex built near their, neighborhood, but how profitable it's become for some of the most influential and powerful Wall Street firms in this country. I was absolutely shocked to discover that at every step in these families' journeys, the 5 families who I follow in this book, there were entire business models designed to capitalize on their precarity. And that's not only the private equity firms like Celeste Landlord, who are buying up vast swaths of America's rental housing and really making that housing much, much more insecure, pushing people out through these automated eviction systems and algorithms that determine, that someone just gets an eviction filing if they're 2 days late on their rent and there's no human to interact with, not only pushing people out of their housing, but increasingly buying up the very sites and places where families and individuals are pushed into once they become homeless. And nowhere is that truer than with this phenomenon of extended stay hotels. It's an entire world of homelessness that we're not seeing. And, during the pandemic, Blackstone and Starwood Capital, these 2 private equity giants, they saw that extended stay America was raking in hundreds of millions of dollars while all other hotels were at like 0 occupancy. And they spent $6 billion buying this chain because they saw that these hotels are concentrated in areas of our country where working people are most likely to become homeless and to lose stable housing. And so you have entire business models, very powerful business models that are actively exacerbating and really profiting off of this insecurity.
Are there examples of communities or policies that have dealt with this in a constructive way? Are there, things that we can point to and say, look, this does work. This community used it, to some success. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as if we really open the lens on this crisis, and, one of the big things I'm trying to show in the book is that the official numbers on homelessness, as bad as they are, and again, we had over the last 2 years the highest level of homelessness on record. As bad as those official numbers are, the reality is actually much, much worse. It's exponentially worse. And I estimate that the actual number is roughly 6 times that of the official number. And the reason I say that is because once we get a sense of the true severity and magnitude, and crucially, the actual root causes of this homelessness catastrophe, we realize that the kind of nibbling around the edges solutions that are often floated will simply not be enough. And a huge thing is keeping people in the homes they already have. And, I think I've been disabused in the process of reporting this book of the notion that if this is solved, it's going to be because some policymaker in Washington or at state level wakes up and is like, I'm going to ease the suffering for these people. some of the most promising trends that we're seeing is the emergence of a really powerful and vibrant tenant rights movement across the country. People organizing in their buildings, in their rental properties, and saying, this is intolerable. We're not going to stand for it. And in cities like Kansas City, we had the emergence of KC Tenants over the last several years that has demanded large-scale policy shifts. And I think that's the most promising thing we have right now, that this is going, if solutions come, they're going to come from those who are closest to the problem and those who are directly impacted, and their neighbors who simply say, like, we're not going to allow millions of people to be the casualties of our city's renaissance, of our city's success and growth, because that's another dynamic. All of these people are losing their housing, not in the midst of like poverty, but in the midst of mounting prosperity in cities like Atlanta, Nashville. So that's really what I see as most hopeful right now.
Yeah, because you have this mass inequality too, where, in these cities, you need the people who are going to work at McDonald's, who are going to do the Uber Eats or the DoorDash. You need, given that's the economic system we apparently have, you need that working class, but you increasingly have completely priced them out of housing. And then you don't have, I know Atlanta is notorious for not having sufficient public transit also, so that people can actually, conveniently commute in. And, speaking to some of that gentrification aspect, one of the families, I'm blanking on the name of the woman that you focus on, one of them had lived previously and grown up in Atlanta in a public housing project, and actually have very fond memories of that public housing project and what life was like there. Those were demolished. And then I believe what happened is they built some replacement that was like mixed income housing, but never sufficient to replace the number of units that had previously been lost. And so I wonder what we can learn from that dynamic in the way that, this kind of like well-intentioned reform movement ultimately exacerbated the issue of, housing crisis for people in the city.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think through Britt's story, Britt is the name of the person that you were just referencing. Through her story, I mean, you kind of get American housing policy in the life of one single family, one single individual. And like you said, she grew up in public housing. She was determined to make Atlanta her home, to make a home for herself and her kids in the city. And she has this line like, "This city is just as much mine as anyone's. Like, I'm not going anywhere." But the title of the book comes from Britt. There is no place for us, because she realizes that this city that she's given everything to, Britt works at the airport when the book begins. She's working at, a place that's like the pride and joy of Atlanta's economy, the busiest airport in the world. And I think it's important to note that one of the most perverse things that this book documents is that the working homeless, these are not people on the fringes of society. They are the people whose labor, whose bodies are powering the very growth that, again, perversely, is not just pushing them out of the neighborhoods they grew up in, but pushing them out of housing, stable housing altogether. And, the policies that emerged in the absence of public housing, once all the public housing in Atlanta was demolished, because Atlanta was the first city in the country to build public housing in the 30s, and it was the first city in the country to sort of undertake this neoliberal experiment in demolishing public housing and turning to the private market through vouchers and through other, incentivizing private development to fill that need. And Britt's story is a really tragic example of how much that promise has failed. And ultimately, her story is an example of how we need just a radical paradigm shift in how we think about housing in this country. Like, housing is, as it's currently conceived, is just auctioned off to the highest bidder. One caseworker in the book refers to it as the housing Hunger Games. And what we've done is we've said this essential human need is going to be, that people are just going to be at the mercy of a market that may or may not have an incentive to keep them housed. And if rents skyrocket past the rate of inflation, so be it. we need a different approach where we start to treat housing the way we do like public education, where we just say this is a basic part of being in this country. We're going to guarantee it for everybody. And there was a time when we had that vision as a country, and there are peer nations who have implemented that vision. It's not this utopian, radical ideal.
That's exactly right. Well, the book, it will break your heart. If you read it, it will absolutely break your heart. But I really recommend it to people because you have so many examples of, people who they win what they consider as like the lottery. They get the voucher to be able to help them afford, housing, and just how that process is all but, fraught with insecurity and no guarantees, and creates this housing Hunger Games situation you're talking about. You go through some of that history and just the dynamics that people are really dealing with on a granular scale. It very much reminded me of the work of Barbara Ehrenreich. So highly recommend it to people. And Brian, thank you so much for taking some time both to explore this issue, which I do think there's a complete blind spot in society for, and also to join us today and help us understand your work.
Thank you so much. It's really meant a lot to talk to you.
Our pleasure.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.